Bryce Greene is always a popular guest of ours. He's an independent writer and political analyst from the United States, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Bryce, can I ask you first about the, I thought, quite significant article in the Wall Street Journal today, the one that said the US is behaving responsibly in the Ukraine. It's the British that are the reckless ones. Does that ring true to you?
Well, certainly the latter part. The British have been very reckless with respect to the Ukraine war, but to say that the United States is not being irresponsible is, I think, laughable. I mean, remember the run-up to the war, the United States refused to negotiate with Vladimir Putin about, very legitimate security interests. Putin has been saying for decades that NATO at its border is unacceptable, and that would cause very intense security concerns for the Russians. The Americans have known this since 2008, if not earlier, and have continued to push for the expansion of NATO, continue to ignore what they understand to be Russian red lines, continue to escalate the war in order to, as the saying goes, to use Ukraine to fight Russia. And after thousands and thousands of lives, we don't know how many, but thousands of lives, they continue the line. They continue to supply weapons. They continue to voice unconditional support for the war. They continue to escalate. And now we have this F-16 business. It seems that there really aren't any adults in the room. And so to call the U.S., anything like a responsible party, I think is laughable.
You know, when this all began, Joe Biden was asked about F-16s and Abrams tanks and so on. And he said, no, we'll not be sending these. That would be tantamount to World War III. What changed?
Well, nothing really has changed. The only thing that we could say that's changed is that the U.S. officials have really gotten a bit cocky about how Vladimir Putin is going to respond. You can read about it if you look at the reporting on the matter. U.S. officials have been saying, oh, well, we shouldn't escalate this far. That might cause Putin to escalate in response. But then when they did it, Putin would be restrained, and then U.S. officials would take that as evidence that they could escalate further. They can say that, well, Putin didn't escalate when we started training Ukrainian soldiers in the United States. Putin didn't escalate when the UK sent depleted uranium. Putin didn't escalate after any of the escalations on the Western side of this conflict, and therefore that Putin will never escalate. And to me, this is just insanely reckless. The fact that Putin hasn't deployed nuclear weapons yet shouldn't preclude the possibility from that happening in the future, shouldn't preclude the possibility that some things will get out of hand that are beyond the control of either Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin that could escalate into a nuclear exchange. The idea that the U.S. can continue to escalate, can continue to, poke the bear, so to speak, can continue to pour weapons, pour advanced weaponry, money, and support into this conflict without a serious escalation it's just ridiculous. I mean, Putin has been saying for quite a while, it's like, what if the F-16s are being flown from NATO countries' air bases? What is Russia supposed to do? Are they supposed to attack a NATO country? These are questions that have been swirling around in the Russian side for quite a long time. They're giving serious consideration to it, given their own geopolitical and strategic objectives. But that conversation doesn't seem to be happening on the U.S. side. And this entire question of how much can we push Putin, that's what they seem to be asking. In the Harper's cover story, what are we doing in Ukraine? It was a very good piece and very hopeful to see that in the Western press, even if it is in Harper's and not in the New York Times. It's hopeful to see, but it's also terrifying because the author spoke to a Pentagon analyst who had been talking about the dangers of pushing up against Russia, against continuing to push NATO up against Russia's borders. And the Pentagon analyst rightly compared it to if Russia would place missiles on Canada's border with the U.S. or Mexico's border with the U.S. How would the U.S. react to that? Well, when this analyst started asking high-level military officials this question, this hypothetical, surprisingly, apparently none of them had actually given it the thought. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, well, damn, I didn't really view what we were doing to the Russians in that light.
Didn't think of that
Are
one.
they children? Yeah, I mean, and these are
Yeah,
supposed to be, credentialed
you've got to ask
adults.
that. I think partly they are. You know, Bryce, a lot of people think we're run by James Bonds, but I've always thought we're run by Austin Powers. It is entirely possible that they hadn't thought of that. It really is, hard though it is for people to believe. I mean,
Exactly.
I sat
And you
amongst
can see
these
it.
people for almost 30 years in Parliament. I know that most of it, you wouldn't send most of them out to buy a loaf. Never mind come up with a world-conquering conspiracy plan.
Right. And if you look at the media reporting on this, I mean, I'm sure you know and your audience knows that the media class of people is almost the same, almost one-to-one as the political class, right? These class of people who make the decisions, who write about the decisions, who give their opinions about what's going on in the world. This class of people really views it the same way. They genuinely view this conflict as a way to preserve democracy against Russian autocracy, without really understanding that if you provoke a war in Ukraine, Ukraine will be destroyed. And no country that has just been destroyed is going to have a vibrant democracy at the end of that destruction. Branko Marcetic had a great article in Jacobin about how the state of Ukrainian democracy isn't strong. Press freedoms are deteriorating. Opposition parties are being banned. Neoliberal policies are being enacted in the shock of war. In fact, I wrote, I think last week, about how despite all of these things, Western institutions are pretending like it's not happening. Reporters Without Borders, a major international NGO, they actually increased Ukraine's press freedom score this year over last year's score, saying that Ukraine is actually more free, that reporters have more freedom, that the media ecosystem is more diverse. To anyone paying attention to this, it's laughable. But these are the assumptions that really govern the way these people operate. And if these are the assumptions that they're operating on, you can't really be surprised when they're making batshit insane decisions about how to proceed with this. Why haven't we heard people talking about negotiations? Well, because people think that Putin's Hitler. Why haven't we talked? Why is no one in the press arguing against Biden's endless escalation? Well, it's because they genuinely think that they are on the side of democracy, and that if they were to push for negotiations, they'd be asking, Ukrainians to sacrifice democracy. So it's a garbage in, garbage out situation. If you don't understand what's going on, you're not going to make good decisions.
No, quite. But the more they talk about democracy, the faster I count my spoons. The countries that are talking most about democracy are rapidly shredding their own democracy. The countries that talk about freedom of the press are the people who've thrown Julian Assange into a dungeon. France, which talks about how Iran behaves towards protesters, is clubbing its own people down, gassing them, shooting them with rubber bullets, sometimes lead, on an almost daily basis. Our countries are not, increasingly not democracies. And yet we're doing all this for Ukrainian democracy? Seriously?
Right. It's a long-standing tradition of Western quote-unquote democracies to justify their imperial ambitions and justify their foreign excursions by saying that we're doing this to, promote democracy. I mean, it's the same thing that the colonizers did in the early colonial era. We're here to spread Christianity. I mean, if you are raised in the ideological environment that doesn't challenge those assumptions, well, then those things aren't going to sound as crazy as they do to the rest of the world. But here in the United States, and I'm sure the UK is very similar, we're some of the most propagandized people on earth. Propaganda is a billions and billions and billions of dollar industry. We've perfected the art of manipulating and lying and spinning and selling nonsense to people. And that's essentially the way our democracy operates. I mean, everything from our elections to our news media systems, all of them are based on spin, public relations, that entire field of, I mean, you can call it psychological manipulation. I mean, that's really what we're seeing here. And when you have peace activists in the United States, so-called peace activists, saying that the United States should be spending more money on weapons to Ukraine, that we need to have solidarity with Ukraine in the name of democracy, in the name of social justice. Well, I mean, then you can really see how far that these tactics, that these manipulations have gone in the United States, in the West, because quote unquote serious people genuinely believe it. Even as you have an entire country being destroyed, even as you have arms manufacturers foaming at the mouth, even as you have BlackRock saying that they're going to be one of the people in charge of rebuilding Ukraine, even as you have all of that going on, you still have people who believe that the United States is over there, that the United States is getting involved, that the entire Western project is designed to promote democracy and democratic values and freedom. It doesn't hold up to any sort of scrutiny, but, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. You know that. Your audience knows this.
No, it's interesting. No,
difficult.
we need to know. We need to know how all this happened, and more importantly, how we can, if it's not too late, get out of it. It's okay here because we're all in the bubble. We are in that propagandized bubble in your country and mine, in the European Union. But as the great Glenn Greenwald pointed out to me on Twitter earlier this evening, this doesn't survive contact with the people outside in the majority world, the 80, 90, almost 90% majority world. They laugh, as the Secretary General of the ANC did to the BBC's Stephen Sackur. They cackled their contempt at our double standards and hypocrisy. That's been one of the biggest stories of the last 500 days, hasn't it? That Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, Africa have said, no, not us, thanks very much, you're on your own.
There's a line you hear a lot in the U.S. media and probably in the entire Western press, is that the world stands behind Ukraine. The world is against Russia. The world is isolating Russia. Well, when you drill down to it, the definition of the world really means Western Europe, the United States, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. The actual majority of the world's population, represented by the BRICS bloc, you know, Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, even the most of the African continent, they're very critical of what the U.S. is doing, what the U.S. has brought upon Ukraine through its expansionary policies, through its stonewalling of negotiations, because they're really more familiar with the realities of U.S. imperialism. These people have been victims of it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so they're really able to see through the spin, the bullshit about whether or not the world is with Ukraine. President Lula of Brazil, newly restored, he actually went to a G7 summit, and he was there to talk to Zelensky. But Zelensky actually avoided him, and Lula said, oh, well, you know, Zelensky's a grown man. He knows what he's doing. He's not interested in peace. And this has been in the long tradition of Lula speaking out against what we're being told about this war. Lula has said that, well, Brazil won't send weapons to Ukraine because he understands that NATO expansion brought this war to Ukraine, and he understands that only a negotiated settlement is going to solve it. Now, that's an obvious observation for any serious person, But the fact that this is treated as insane or loony or anti-American, as I've even heard it called, it's just a joke. Lula is just understanding that the U.S., the West, is an imperialist power who pushed up against Russia with the deliberate intention of provoking an invasion, and that this carnage, this bloodshed that we're seeing in Ukraine is the predictable result. And the only way to stop it is to seriously pursue peace talks. And there are only a few countries in the entire world right now who are actually opposing peace talks in Ukraine. That's, chiefly the United States. When Xi Jinping put forth the 12-point peace proposal.
Only a few, but it's it's only a few, but it's the few that have the veto. They clearly can veto, have already vetoed. Boris Johnson delivered the veto in person a year ago. From the UK, he traveled to Kiev to say to Zelensky, do not sign any peace deal that emerges out of the negotiations in Turkey. So the people who've got the veto are determined to use it. So this war will continue until the last Ukrainian, won't it?
God hopes that it doesn't. I mean, I really hope that this war ends sooner rather than later. If the West would have its way, then yeah, I think you're right. You might see the complete destruction of the Ukrainian state as an independent entity. It might turn into some sort of rump state, tin-pot dictatorship. I'm not really sure. But the only way that we can avoid the bloodshed is if people sit down at the negotiating table and if Washington stops obstructing it. And the only way that that's going to happen is if people in the Washington press corps, if the opinion makers, thought leaders, as people like to say, start seriously putting pressure on politicians, elected officials, Biden administration officials to actually come to the negotiation table. And we have seen that there are at least a few people within the U.S. government who are understanding that this is an untenable situation, that the quote unquote long war in Ukraine is you can't fight it. Like, that's a disaster for everyone involved. But the problem is that the only reason that a lot of them believe that is because they believe that the main focus of the U.S. empire should be China. And if you've been paying attention to what's going on in China for the last year, for the last several years, in all actuality, the U.S. is really doing almost exactly what they're doing in Ukraine. They recognize that China has red lines in Taiwan. They understand it fully, and yet they're with full steam ahead. They are plowing through it. They are increasing the amount of connections between U.S. officials and Taiwanese officials. They're increasing the flow of weapons. They're having the largest ever military drills in that area. They're positioning nuclear submarines in South Korea. This is insanity. But it's been reported that Xi Jinping actually told Biden explicitly that if the U.S. continues to push in Taiwan, there will be war. China is willing to go to war over it. And polls show that the majority of Chinese are also willing to go to war over Taiwan.